Okay, so thank you everybody for coming tonight. This is Genesis part two. Um, as I was saying just before this, I actually forgot that today was Thursday, and so I am more unprepared than usual. But we've been, um, I think, having pretty good discussions in the chat, um, which that's actually helpful for me to stay, even if the questions themselves are off topic, just having them on my mind helps me to kind of think about things and write things down throughout the week. And so, uh, yeah, so if you're not looking at that, reading at that, please do and share your thoughts and questions because that helps me know how to direct things and to direct the conversation. Um, um, but we'll jump into the section. Um, oh yeah, I need to let's I will share share my screen. Yeah. Okay. Now that I am sharing my screen, okay, you all should be able to should have done that at the beginning. Like that. But okay. So we're doing the second half of Genesis 2, starting at verse 15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper for him. Now out of the ground the Lord Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. For Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. Uh, I need to
Might not mute.
mute you.
How do I do it?
Here, I'll mute you, Dad. I server muted you. Um, if you have a question, tell Evan that you have Evan let me know that you have a question. And while he slept, one of his ribs had closed up its place. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Okay, so as we kind of get into this tonight, we need to sort of remember a lot of the framing things that I said before about the question of, is this a chronological view? Is this a spotlight view? All of that stuff. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch uh, last week's. Um, but I'm gonna try and not harp on that in particular um, for today, but it will um, it does it does affect how you end up viewing um, what's going on here. Um, a couple of the things that I want to, so like for example, um, it says that he took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So if you have a chronological view, there's really no issue with this work it and keep it part, right? Because uh, that's happening um, after the seventh day of creation. If you're taking a spotlight view, the work it and keep it part kind of brings up a little bit of a question mark. In the same way that this part here about this at last is the bone of my bones, right? This at last implies a long period of time, and the command to work it and keep it implies a long period of time. And so if you take a spotlight view of what's happening in here, you then have a little bit of a problem because all of this portion right here is supposed to be taking place in a 24-hour time span. And so it just seems really weird that after a single day, like Adam is tired of the work and is really happy that he makes this little poem whenever a woman finally shows up. That seems like something that implies thematically a longer time period. But that's not something that I want to camp out on. Instead, what I want to camp out on is um, what is the first rule in the Bible, right? Uh, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So, a couple of things that I want to point out about this rule. The first is that, like a lot of things that we're going to be seeing in uh, in Genesis in general, yes, this is the first rule. It is a command, but even the command itself, especially in the punishment, um, I would argue that this is not really an active punishment, right? Um, it doesn't say when you eat of this, I will kill you, right? It says when you eat of it, you will die. And so it is a passive effect. It is a description of the state of the world, of the state of affairs. Um, the other thing that I want to camp out on, because it's gonna uh, it affects pretty much almost every other doctrine that matters in the Bible, is what does it mean to die? Um, this is going to affect. So I have listed out like this is affects your view of physicalism, of Calvinism, of eschatology, because like in Revelation it talks about death of death, but you're not going to be able to define, right, because death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. You're not even going to begin to define that, in my opinion, until you've actually defined what die means for the first time. Um, and then also quickly, I just want to point out, I think it should also be noted that it's debatable whether or not Adam and Eve, whenever this is happening, even know what dying is really. Um, so, right. So first of all, they don't have knowledge of good and evil, so they might not really know what dying is. If you take that young Earth creation view where there was no death and there was no dying, well, then they definitely don't know where this is, what this is. Um, there is an argument that's made um, by Braxton Hunter, who is a Christian apologist YouTuber that's pretty good, um, where he makes the argument that the knowledge of good and evil here um, is an experiential knowledge of good and evil. And so that is what he argues, that that is what they lack. Not that they don't understand the propositions. And so he makes a difference between propositional knowledge and experiential knowledge, which uh, is a thing that I think he gets from John Vervaeke, but I can't prove that because. But basically, it's the difference of um, like my child, and this again, if you go back and talk about last week about how I don't think you can really talk about these things unless you start talking about them in levels of talking about something like maturity. Um, if you think about it, a child might know that they shouldn't put their hand on the stove because they know that they'll get in trouble, and they might have like a propositional knowledge of what that means, um, but they don't have experiential knowledge of the pain of putting their hand on the stove. Um, that's a basic understanding of what those two different types of knowing are. Um, the most common, well, I don't know if that's true. I don't really know what the most common way that people understand die here in this portion, but to me, it's always been obvious. I think it's pretty obvious that the description here of dying is something like what we might refer to as a spiritual death. Because, spoiler alert, whenever they eat of this, they don't physically die. And so um, you have to find a way to account for that. And for me, I've always been very quick to just say, oh, well, it's a spiritual death. And what I mean by spiritual death is death as separation. Because what happens there is that a separation, whenever the fall occurs in the next chapter, which we're not there yet, uh, that's what I think is going on. And I think that that I think that that also apply. I think you can also make that distinction with uh, actual physical death. That it's just really it's just a type of separation. Um, Someone that's coming from a more physicalist camp will say something along the lines of dying means to stop existing. Um, and you pretty much have multiple ways that if you have that line of thinking, uh, that like cessation of existence type of view, um, your two options for how to interpret this view are either one, when it says for in that day that you eat of it, you fall back onto that day is a long period of time. This pretty famously, one of the more famous young Earth creationists, Kent Hovind, um, he will believe in a 24-hour period of day for up here. But then whenever he gets to the word day down here, he'll fall back on, oh, well, a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord. And so Adam lived for about 1,000 years. And so that's within the time frame. And so he still died on that day, which to me is a little bit of being sneaky and not being consistent. The other option is that you say if you watch that playlist by Inspiring Philosophy, the other option is to say that no, what happened in that day is not that that uh, like Adam and Eve will die, but that on that day they will surely die. So basically, they on the day that they eat of the tree of the knowledge, they gain the condition shall surely die, meaning that basically they become mortal. They become susceptible to death, which I, that might be a valid interpretation of it. Um, I'm not wholly against that one, but those are kind of your options there for how to take that one. I want to argue for just a I just want to argue for a little bit against the view that it means uh, and you can mix by the way you can mix and match these like the definition of death with how you take the punishment for this command. You can mix and match it a little bit, but I want to argue against having the physicalist notion just for a second of that death means the cessation of existence. um, I think that a lot of times that comes from this idea that Judaism didn't have a view of the afterlife. Um, as far as I can tell, that seems to be more of a modern interpretation that I hear from people. Um, I think that it's painfully obvious that Jews believed in the afterlife. When we get to later on in Genesis, is going to constantly talk about um, being gathered, like being gathered to together with their fathers, like Abraham purchases a cave specifically for burial of the family. Joseph wants his bones taken back to um, taken back to Canaan so that he can be gathered together with his fathers. Um, and then the most explicit one to me is uh, I believe it's in like First Kings or something like that. Somewhere dealing with Saul. Saul goes to a medium or a witch and asks to speak to the ghost of Samuel the prophet who had died. And it says that Samuel came up out of the ground and like actual Samuel, and the fact that it's actual Samuel ends up scaring uh, the witch. Um, and so it very clearly is confirming that Samuel has some sort of existence after he dies. So there is some sort of a afterlife. And so um, I tend to think that that view of the definition of death isn't really a good one to hold to. Part of the reason why I'm spending so much time onto that is if you start researching this more, especially if you get into things like uh, varying views of hell. I have a whole video on my unique view on hell. That's a huge topic on that. Um, and if you look up like people like Chris Date, who's probably the number one debater in favor of the annihilationist view, and just online in general among apologists, annihilationism seems to be kind of a growing trend, a growing fashion for people to adopt that view. Um, it's seemingly one of the tenets of people that take that view is that they have this view of what the definition of death is that it means ceasing to exist. Um, and I just think that there's very little evidence for that. And I think that this section right here um, actually demonstrates that death should probably be understood as something other than ceasing to exist. And I think that separation is the best definition for it. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if anyone wanted to ask any questions regarding that topic before I go on.
I had a question about whenever you mentioned that there's debate on whether Adam and Eve knew what death was.
Yes.
So it made a lot of sense the last class whenever you were saying that there could be like obviously death of animals and potentially even death of people before the fall. And I was wondering if that was a reason why, because Eve misquotes God in saying that you will, when you, if you touch it, you will die. Is that potentially, maybe this is a dumb question, but like, is that potentially evidence for the fact that they did know what death was because she touches it and she's like, oh, I didn't die, and so I'll go ahead and now eat it as well because like I didn't die when I touched it.
Yeah, I
Or
mean,
is that still good?
yeah, possibly. I mean, unless you want to, unless you're dealing with somebody who's taking that like difference of propositional knowledge and experiential knowledge sort of a view. Someone that has that kind of a view would probably make the stance of, well, yeah, sure, she could tell because she has still propositional knowledge of it. That being said, I actually would tend to agree with you on that. That I think that actually that does show that there is some that would serve as a type of evidence for there being uh, death.
Experiential knowledge.
Well, yeah, experiential knowledge of something else dying, right? And
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I I
Okay.
wouldn't go. So this also goes into something that I haven't mentioned, which I'm kind of steering away from, but I guess I'll just touch on for a second. Is that uh, there's another understanding of the knowledge of good and evil, and this gets into like Matthew Pajot, the book on symbolism. He argues that a better understanding is to call it the knowledge of good and bad, and that it's it is it's not necessarily the knowledge of evil, wrong things, but just of bad things happening to you. And I think that that would kind of I struggle with knowing. I was like, is that the same thing as saying experiential knowledge of uh, of of something bad happened to you? Like, is that the same thing? Um, uh, but I thought you were. I guess it doesn't matter. I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question whenever you were about to ask that. But uh, I'll try not to get
Yeah,
distracted by that. Yeah, go on.
No, that
yeah,
makes sense. Thank you.
yeah, Kyle. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to keep it to one right now
Okay.
because I don't want it to. I want you to be able to get back to teaching. I just want to better understand because some of my questions right now are really about just gaining a better understanding of your full thought process on it because I don't because some of it I just don't know, you know.
Yep.
So like um when they sinned, is it your view that the consequence of sin was not cosmic in the sense that it affected the whole world, and it was really just a spiritual consequence, meaning, you know, the ground was not cursed, additionally accursed. A whole series of curses that, of course, like the young Earth creationist view would say, the whole Earth changed. There
Yep.
was like this drastic cosmic change,
Yeah.
and so is it your? Would it be more of your view that that nothing really changed in the physical end? It was really just a spiritual um, consequence.
So
So,
let me.
yeah, that's that. I guess I'll leave it at that for right now because I do have a series of questions, but I don't want to eat up all the
Yeah.
time.
I guess I'll just. I'm gonna punt a little bit on this one because really we'll end up talking about that more next week when we actually get to the curse. Um. That being said, I'll just state my answer here. Um. I agree that that like all of creation is somehow in a fallen state due to um so I want to be careful here. Creation is in a fallen state. It's mostly because of this first fall, but this first fall is not the only fall. There is a series of falls that take place. And what I do tend to want to get away from, which is what I usually hear from a young Earth creationist perspective, is almost like the idea that something magical happens with the fall. I do tend to want to distance myself from that. Particularly with this idea, like I think the most obvious one that I disagree with is whenever we get to like the ages of people, and people will sometimes have this idea of like, oh, well, the fall corrupted our DNA, and that's why we no longer live for hundreds of years. I completely disagree with that. And I have I have kind of a lot of problems with that. And that's not to say that I think that nothing um happens. Um, like for one thing, I do think that there is some kind of a change, because it does say like the ground is cursed and like thorns will be brought up. Now there is a I don't know. I don't know. Does that mean that there were no thorns prior? Um, and now there are, or just man hadn't experienced thorns, and now the man is going to be living in a place where he does experience thorns. Um, I tend to think that it's more of the second one, but we'll talk about that more. We'll talk about that more next week. Um,
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, I guess the only reason I'm asking that is because I do think it ties into the concept of death, what that means. Because I think it's all kind of connected. If you take the view that death here is merely spiritual, then it would somewhat follow that the curses and the consequences for sin are spiritual. Um, does that make sense?
yes, except for yeah, I'd argue that what's happening like isn't merely spiritual because like I think physically physically moving out of the space where God inhabits is going to have physical and spiritual ramifications. like um just like go not stop stopping going to church has a physical effect on you. like it has spiritual effects on you, but it also has physical effects on you. Like I believe that. Right? Like in some ways, like I think there's some New Testament evidence of this when we start talking about things like uh, the way that Paul is dealing with communion, where he's like, some of you are getting sick because like you're not dealing with communion right. Like I think that's related to this idea. Um, like I don't I I have a increasingly um as we'll get to this in a little bit, but as is maybe referenced a little bit in a lot of our discussions about Rock World, um, I have an increasingly dislike of making clear delineations between something being physical and something being spiritual. Um, I think that there's a lot more overlap in those things, and I think that things aren't as arbitrary as they seem. I think that's one of the kind of the main goals, and especially actually this is actually a good segue into the next section because this kind of relates to what we've been talking about on there, and it talks about what's going on here. Um, I don't think that the uh, like okay, Genesis is so incredibly deep, okay, and it is such a compact and tight story that has lived through the ages. I don't think there's any wasted space in this. And so, because of that, I don't think that there's anything really arbitrary going on. So, whenever we get, so like, I don't think things are. This is what I'm trying to get at whenever I say like a magical change. Like I don't think that there's just a magical change, um, and then all of these random curses happen. Like I think that they're all fundamentally linked together, and I think that even goes with like the naming portion that we're getting into right here. Um, so I'll go over that. You know, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called the living creature, that was its name. So I'm gonna harp on what Ryan said just for a little bit. I'm gonna go to this. Um, uh, I, you're not gonna have any background for this, but he said naming and describing are two different things. I don't think that that's true. Um, naming and actually, very ironically, I wish I could actually maybe I can search for it. My name is Adore. My name is Adora Bliss. I don't know where we got this book from, uh, but we try to read a book um, to Sophia every night before she goes to sleep. Um, and tonight was the first night that like 2 nights ago we have a whole stack of books um, in the other room that we've never read to her before, and I just got tired of reading the same stories over and over, and so I went and grabbed some new books like a night or two ago, and tonight I read this book for the first time, and this this book, literally every single page, um, so like maybe I could do some example stuff like looking at it. Oh nope, that didn't work. Uh, literally every single page. So like is a little description about what the animal is, and then it says, and that's the reason why I'm called a clownfish. Like this one's uh, like my name is clownfish because I'm painted like a clown. Um, I think that the idea that names and descriptions are separate things is actually much more of a modern idea than most people are willing to admit. Like the evolution of names in the English language is honestly like pretty different from most other cultures. Um, and it was very normal to like give a description and be and go, okay, that's what that thing's name is. And in fact, when we get to after Genesis 11 and we start talking about all of the different patriarchs, basically everybody's name is a description of who they are. Like Abram is um or like Abraham is like the father of many nations. Um, Isaac is called Laughter because his mom laughed. Um, Esau is called Esau because he is red. Um, Jacob is called Jacob because he's grabbing his brother's heel. Like, um, there is a very uh, ongoing, intentional effort in the biblical stories to draw a connection between names and identity. And I think it is the wrong move to think that those things are arbitrary. Um, in particular relationship to this story, this was going to be um, this was going to end up being one of the discussion questions, but I'll go ahead and point it here to kind of make my point. Um, if he is naming every living creature, that also means that he is naming the serpent, right? Because the serpent is more crafty than any other beast of the field. And what is he doing here? He is naming every beast of the field. And it says, now the serpent was more crafty than every other beast of the field. You click on serpent, um, like the name, like serpent, is like it is related, like to the word crafty. Like they they're they're linked, and so this goes back to kind of this idea that we've been getting about in the rock world thing, um, where I think naming is kind of intrinsic, um, and this idea of kind of even what Evan brought up of like co-mutual naming. Like maybe God didn't need to have the name Yahweh until there were people or that there were other agents. Um, because there's always like this question of why did God allow the serpent to be in the garden? And my answer to that is pretty much always that fundamentally the serpent needed to be in the garden so that people could have free will. If the serpent is somehow a if if the necessity for the existence of the serpent is determined by the necessity to preserve our free will, then in some ways the creation of the serpent was necessary in order to have the creation of man. And so in some ways there is a like coupled duality creation. I don't know how, I don't have the words. I'm stumbling right now because I don't really have the words to describe the idea that I'm trying to put forth. That like the serpent had to be made in order for man to really become man. And like that choice had to be there. And so like his existence is a logical consequence of the creation of man. And so in some ways that could be how I would conceive of the idea of man naming the serpent. Um, hopefully I tried to express that. And just, just to
Oops.
let me just really quickly wrap a bow on that thought, which will end up. Well, I really was trying to say this for talking more about next week. Um, I think that the conclusion of that idea is related to the idea of um well I'll just say it. I was going to type it in, but yeah, you all know that I'm not making it up. When Jesus says the Son of Man will be lifted up like the bronze serpent, um the solution to death ends up being that a man has to become the serpent. Um, and so that's sort of the end of that symbolism rant. You can ask your question, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. I will say that I've never actually thought that deeply about that ever. So this is like very good. Um, is it okay? I have a question about well, a comment about 18 and 19, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the Lord God said, it was not good for man to be alone. I'll make him a helper fit for him.
Yep.
Right. So like, I heard somebody talk about this recently, and I had never heard this in this light up until maybe, I don't know, 3, 4 months ago. And I thought it was a fascinating idea. And this kind of ties into like God taking dominion and everything.
Yep.
And what the scholar was saying was that we have this idea that man was alone and God didn't want him to be alone. And so he gave him a helper so that he didn't feel alone. What the scholar was saying was, no, no, no. It's not about him being alone because actually he had God and he was completely independent and didn't need somebody like in terms of emotional support and connection, but more that in order to subdue the earth and multiply, that's why he gave him a helper. And then later it says like somewhere that essentially like that was the last thing that he did, like in terms of creation.
Mm.
And so like that's why you see that wording. I can't remember where that was, but uh anyways, that was my I had heard that recently. I thought I'd share that, get your thoughts on it.
Yeah. I think the gist of it, um, I agree with that. So again, this is going to end up taking us to it. It sounds like a cop out because I keep saying it, but like Genesis is incredibly deep. There's like a multitude of meanings for all these things. If I were to actually talk about all of the ways in which everything can be understood, we never leave Genesis. Um, and so, yes, I think that's true. Yeah, that is the um, yeah. I think that yeah, that's true. That's the last thing. Um, that is created. That's going to be true on either kind of view that you take. Woman is the last thing, and uh, yeah, I think that is obviously that is part of the Dominion uh, task. Um, Although, yeah, you get into that like the fact that the Dominion task is given in chapter one versus chapter two. But the gist of it I still agree with. The only part that I don't agree with and was actually my next section of notes that I was gonna spend a little bit of time on. It is actually I'm gonna make a controversial statement, um, and where you said that the guy said that like he didn't that man didn't need um like a partner for emotional support because he had God. I'm actually gonna buck that a little bit. Um, uh, I think so. This verse is one of many that I would cite whenever I'm trying to state that whenever I make my meaning of life case. That the meaning of life is to fellowship with God and others in creation. I think that this verse shows that. Um, I know for me, for many years, whenever I was a teenager, um, I thought that um, I thought fellowship. So whenever I was young and a teenager, I thought the meaning of life was fellowship with God. It wasn't until I was a little bit older in college that I augmented that a little bit and started saying that that the meaning of life was fellowship with God and others. And it was probably only in the past 3 or 4 years that I was like, you know what? Actually, my definition was missing something a little bit. It's fellowship with God and others in creation. And this verse is part of that. Um, I I think that I think that there is something fundamentally not good um, by um, man just being with God. Um, I think that you cannot. I think if you look at whenever Jesus gets asked, what is what is the greatest commandment, and he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He answers a question that is looking for a singular answer with a double answer, which means that to me, you should be taking that double answer as a single answer, meaning that if you want to properly love God, you actually can't do it unless you're loving other people. And you can't love other people unless you're loving God. I think that second part is pretty uncontroversial, and everybody under the sun will agree that you can't really correctly love other people unless you are loving God. The part where people will fight back on me is whenever I say I don't think you can properly love God unless you're loving other people. But there was definitely part of the reason why I say that comes from my own just experience. Whenever I was younger, I used to think that I got to a point where I kind of thought that going to church was a little bit useless. um, uh, Whenever I was going to church at Lakes Area Assembly of God, there were three people in the youth group: me, Jeff Ayers, and Anthony Schraumberger. Um, Anybody else that came was a like middle school kid that got dragged there, that happened to get dragged there that week by their parent. Um, but pretty much the three of us were, and most nights it was just the three of us. And at that point in time, I was driving myself to church. and I realized uh, at that point in my life that I take this Christian thing more seriously than most other people seem to. And so whenever I went away to college, I kind of decided that, okay, this is just a me and God thing. I don't really need anybody else. Um, Now that being said, I still was like, okay, but I think I probably should find a church, and I did end up finding a church group and ended up going to it. But even during the course of that and going to the church group, I had friends and was friends with pretty much everybody in that church group. But uh, I kind of came to the conclusion one day that I was like, all of these people are weird. Um, and if I wasn't a Christian, I realized I realized if I wasn't a Christian, I wouldn't be friends with any of them. And at that point, I started to think I was like, well, maybe I should just stop coming. And I remember I went to it. I think it was during like a summer, like probably like my junior year or something like that. I went one day and I had been feeling like I should just stop coming to the church group. And I was like, God, I don't understand why you made all of these people, and you made these people that I have to deal with, because none of them understand me. I really don't understand them. All of them seem a little bit stupid, and nobody really like even the people that attend regularly don't seem to take this as seriously as I do. Like, so what is the point of this? Why do I keep coming to this thing? And for the life of me, I don't remember exactly what happened, but um, we were all standing around and sharing um, just little testimonies before we pray. And something that one of the other girls said, and like I said, I don't remember what it was. It just really spoke to me. And it was in that moment that I kind of had one of these aha moments, and I realized, oh, this is why I keep coming to this church thing. It's actually because you're supposed to be with all of the weird people that are different. Like, that's the purpose of this creation. The purpose of this creation is not just to be with God and to get into heaven. Like, it is to be with God and all of these other people in heaven. And to me, that also helps you make sense of this idea that Jesus constantly talks about, where he says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And it's this idea that if you understand that a part of heaven is the other people, then you can have heaven on earth now. And especially if you start to understand whenever Jesus says, don't don't store your treasures here, store your treasures in heaven, that that's not talking about material things, because creating you're talking about the God of the universe who can create anything. I mean, that's what this whole thing in Genesis is about, is that he can make anything and he makes everything. And so if he can make anything and everything just by saying it, if you want an Xbox or a Ferrari or whatever, in heaven it's not a big deal. But what is a big deal is if you can get one of those other humans to come along with you. That is a big deal. That's an extremely big deal. And it's what reality was made for, is to try and get those other humans into Eden. That's the point. Um, and so my controversial statements that I have written down are: fellowship with just God is actually not enough. Fellowship with just your parents is not enough. Fellowship with just your spouse is not enough. Fellowship with just your family is not enough. You need all of those things, and those things have a hierarchy of priorities, especially at different stages of your life. But you need all of them. I'm running out of time. I'm going to quickly just run through some things. The thing about the rib, most scholars think that it actually has nothing to do with ribs, and that it should be understood as side. So even like right here, it says side. That the whole thing about ribs seems to be a modern quirk of translation. Most everybody agrees that it actually should be understood as side. So a piece of his side is taken out. Therefore, so this last verse. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That therefore portion should be understood. So I talked about last week about how the when no bush, so that when no X portion is kind of like a once upon a time, such and such a thing happened. This therefore portion can be taken as like kind of the conclusion of that whole thing, and so it's to kind of it's to kind of give you that like understanding of, oh, this whole little story here, kind of the point of that is so that you understand that a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's that kind of demonstrates that this is the lesson for like this portion. And what I would argue is that the purpose of this story is not related to this, related to the stated explicit purpose. I think that the way that we should understand this stated explicit purpose here, not that that's the only purpose of this portion of the text, which we've just been talking about a bunch for the last hour. I don't think this is like a a lot of times people will use this as a like this shows that like heterosexuality is like the correct thing, or like right, it's not Adam and Steve, it's Adam and Eve, like that's the point of this. I don't actually think that that's what the point of this is. I actually think that the point of this is to establish monogamy as the ideal like familial relationship. I actually think that that's what's going on here. And I think to me that is one of the reasons why once we get a little bit later into Genesis in a couple chapters, we'll see that this ideal is repeatedly not achieved and not adhered to, and that in and of itself, the fact that people are not adhering to this ideal is the thing that causes subsequent falls. So whether that be the falls related to Lamech and his multiple wives, the falls related to Genesis 6 with the sons of God and the daughters of man, whether that's related to Abraham and his issues with how he treats his wife when going to Egypt, and Hagar, and Jacob with uh, Leah and his other wife that he likes that I can't remember her name. Um,
Rachel.
Rachel. There we go. Yeah. Um, I think all of that is connected in this idea that they are not they're not achieving this first ideal. Um, the only other thing is that just further evidence of to me of and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Um, that could be expanded upon a bunch, but I don't have time. But the point that I just want to point out is that to me, I think that intuitively, if you think about a person that can be naked and not ashamed, if children are not the first thing that comes to your mind, uh, the only other thing is like a crazy person. And so I think that this is further evidence that we should be thinking of Adam and Eve in something like childlike terms or something having to do with maturity and that what's going to happen in the next uh, chapter is related to this idea of maturity and we'll end up I have a bunch of notes about maturity that we'll end up talking about next week. But very quickly at the end here, if there's any more questions, if they're too long, I'll ask that they get asked in the chat and we'll deal with it there. No? Okay. Well, we'll end the recording there. Thank you so much.